Hi, I'm Jacqueline Bublitz, also known as Rock, and I am recording this from Melbourne. I'm traveling at the moment, which is why there's some suitcases in the background, and this is not my usual writing space. That's down in New Plymouth in Taranaki. So I'm recording this from Melbourne, and I'm actually going to be asking myself the questions today as a circumstance of where I am right now. Now, I didn't make up the questions, but I am asking myself the questions. So, this is a first for me. I am interviewing myself today. So, let's get straight into it with the first question. So, Leave the Girls Behind is a haunting cat and mouse crime that moves the action from New York to New Zealand, where serial killers' crimes expand out from the past to the time when the book is set. Can you briefly outline the book's origin and what your intentions were when you started? Okay, so Leave the Girls Behind is a companion piece to my first novel, Before You Knew My Name, in that it grew out of not only the themes that I was exploring in that novel around gendered violence and who we consider to be the so-called perfect victim, but also there was a specific line in that book that had resonated with quite a few readers, and that line was in relation to somebody related to the perpetrator. The line was, "It's never just one life that these men destroy." And I started thinking when enough people had said that had got them thinking too, like, well, who else gets impacted? Who else are we not hearing about when these crimes hit the media, hit the news? And I started doing research into the wives and partners and children of serial killers. And then I came up with a way of telling a different version of these stories that I am consistently trying to explore around gendered violence and the impacts on society. In this case, I started looking at all of the people, women in particular, who orbit around a serial killer or a mass murderer, and how they may or may not either become victims themselves or potentially in some cases assist the perpetrator, whether knowingly or not, in committing their heinous crimes. So that is the origin of Leave the Girls Behind, and then it went off into as my books tend to do, into some strange and weird and wonderful territory from there. Okay, second question is, one key component of Leave the Girls Behind is a study of trauma, and especially how childhood trauma can shape us, and what took you in this direction. Well, I've long been a fan of a nonfiction book called The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk. I first encountered that book in 2014 when I was working on what would become my first novel. And it was a book. It's a book about the exploration of PTSD and CPTSD. That's complex trauma, and it was like being given the keys to human behavior, to what had observed in the world, in my own behaviors, but also that of people around me, which is that there's a version of us that walks into the room with us that isn't who we are today. It isn't necessarily, the 48-year-old Rock or Jacqueline. There's a younger version of me that often reacts to situations, and why is that? And it got me thinking about all of the versions of ourselves, all of the ways that the experiences that we have, good and bad, so not just traumatic experience, but how those experiences inform who we are now, so that there's a past version of us sort of sometimes competing with the current version of us when we're reacting to a particular situation. I find that really rich, fertile territory. And luckily for me, there are a lot of really smart people, neuroscientists, psychologists, and psychiatrists who are really doing some deep investigation and work into how trauma informs who we are as individuals, and then collectively what that means for us as we try to build a safer society, not just when it comes to crimes, but an emotional safety for people as well. So I think it's a theme that you'll see me returning to again and again as I am, become the sort of lay person's expert in complex trauma in particular. Okay, the third question is, you describe your writing approach as a heightened real life, and can you expand on that definition of writing about heightened real life? So, everything that I approach in my writing, I want it to be grounded in reality. It's really important to me that anything that happens in my books, even the most seemingly outlandish thing, could happen. Uh, and so when I say heightened reality, I say that I'm writing about often the worst moments in a person's life, um, but not moments that are beyond the the realm of possibility. Unfortunately, because I'm writing about some fairly gruesome things sometimes, and so I do a lot of research about other crimes that the similar perhaps to I don't want to say inspired by too often, but other. Murders or gendered crimes that I'm aware of or that I become aware of through my research, to really sort of investigate how those crimes happened, not just the crimes themselves, but the context in which those crimes happened. And then, if I, for example, have characters who need to do something to try to solve that crime, I make sure that either other people have already, citizen detectives, for example, have there's a pathway through their experiences to actually finding the kind of information that a character would need to find. Like my Ruthie in my second book is a citizen detective of sorts, and everything she did throughout that book, I had to make sure that I was able to do too. And that's not something that I would regularly do or think about. I'm not at home in New Plymouth trying to solve cold cases, but I do want to make sure when I'm writing about them that I would have the ability to do what my characters are telling the reader that they are doing. And I think it's because I take it really seriously. I'm writing about a version of crimes that we're all unfortunately far too familiar with when it comes to in the case of the sort of the framework of my novels, women being murdered by men. And I want to make sure that I'm not sensationalizing, I'm not turning it into entertainment, even if hopefully there are aspects of my books that are entertaining. So I just take real life and then I take it up a notch, which I think a lot of us novelists are trying to do. Okay, the next question. Uh, it's really important to you that your books are victim centered rather than perpetrator driven. What drives that approach? So I think that comes through, and this theme is going to sort of run through, anytime I talk about my books. I'm not interested in scandalizing or titillating, entertaining the reader with like the worst things that humans can do to each other and the worst moments or some of the worst moments in a person's life. I'm trying to approach the subject matter with empathy, with hopefully a little insight through, all of the, as I mentioned before, very smart people who are doing the actual mahi, who are doing the research and the work to figure out why people treat each other the way they do. So, as much as I love a whodunit and as much as I love a good mystery, and inevitably when I'm in particular watching something accusing pretty much every single character, main or otherwise, of being the perpetrator. As much as I love that kind of setup when it comes to crime fiction, I am not trying to, not necessarily trying to do that in my books. What I'm trying to say is, look at the impact that this has. Look at, just to sort of paraphrase from the beginning of my first book, look at everything that we lose when these kind of crimes happen. It's not just the sensationalism of the horrific nature of the crime. There's an entire universe that's lost when someone is murdered in that way, and the sort of the circles and the way that so many more people are affected by these crimes than perhaps what we're getting told about when we're just focusing on the perpetrator and what they did. You are on record as saying you value authenticity and often share some aspects of yourself in your work. Can you elucidate? Okay, so again, when it comes to the kinds of stories that I'm trying to tell, I take them seriously. I do try to occasionally be funny, and I hope that comes through at times. But I'm taking them seriously. I want them to feel. I want the reader to feel as if they are, for example, listening to a podcast, or if they're so inclined, have logged onto a true crime citizen detectives forum and they're reading about cases and engaging with people who are as interested in these aspects of the crime as they are. And at the same time, I want to show that my victims, my dead girls, had a full and engaging life outside of this worst thing that happened to them, or will happen to them, depending on what story I'm telling. And so I give these characters sometimes aspects of my life. So an obvious one would be in Leave the Girls Behind. There's a focus on musical theatre, jazz hands musical theatre, because I happen to love musical theatre, and I wanted to give my character the kind of safety and joy, these joyous moments that musical theatre gives me. So I gave those to the character so we could have a little bit of light and shade while she's navigating this these crimes that have so influenced her and traumatized her. She's also gonna, go to the bar where she works and listen to Stephen Sondheim songs. And so the authentic piece just comes back to that heightened reality, grounding everything in reality, making sure it's within the realm of possibility, and then also giving, hopefully there are ways that the reader will recognize themselves on the page that are very separate to these terrible things that have happened to these characters. Okay, the next question is, can you tell us about creating the wonderfully haphazard, unreliable citizen detective Ruth Ann Baker? Do you hear her voice in your head when you are writing and beyond? Well, I hear all of my characters long after I've stopped writing about them. And I mean, maybe actually not so much hear them as I feel them. There's the sense of them. They're just like hanging around me all the time. A little bit, perhaps like Lenny in my first book, for anyone who's familiar with my first book, where there's this idea that there's a lot of dead girls hanging around her because they like being around her, I think, and hope that my characters like being around me. But Ruth Ann Baker, Ruthie, from Leave the Girls Behind, has been delightfully called haphazard heroine, and I'm grateful for that because there are other names for her, for her character like her, where they're completely unreliable and maybe a little bit distanced from that reality that I'm trying to achieve. But she is a character where I really wanted to explore, if you don't believe in coincidence, which she doesn't, uh, what does that mean? Are you going to jump at every shadow? Are you going to believe everything that seems, every answer that you're given? Are you going to jump at it because you're not looking at it critically? You're so involved. In this case, she's investigating or reinvestigating the murder of her childhood best friend. And how it potentially relates to a new case of a missing girl 19 years later in the present day. And for Ruthie, everything feels like a sign or a message because she doesn't believe in coincidence. If you don't believe in coincidence, like I said, then what filter are you going to have to be able to say, that's just happenstance, that's just circumstance. This doesn't actually mean what I think it does or what I want it to mean. And so she's bouncing off the walls of her mind, and sometimes, well, almost literally at times. And I think that we're all capable of a version of that when we get really invested in a story and we think that we've cracked the case. So there's lots of cases, real life cases out there. I'm just going to give a really, I don't know if it's generationally still obvious, but let's just say Lindy Chamberlain back in the 80s. Did she murder her child, or was that child, Azaria, taken by a dingo? Turns out, spoiler alert, Azaria, unfortunately, poor Bub, was taken by a dingo. But there were so many people so invested in working out whether it was Lindy Chamberlain or the dingo, that any piece of information that came to them that fit with their narrative, fit with their bias about what happened, they would seize it and they would use it as further proof that they were right, that they had cracked the case. And so with Ruthie, I really wanted to explore, and there's many, many examples of where we as a public often pile on to somebody because we believe that we know more about the case than we actually do. Because actually, the truth is, citizen detectives, there have been can be a real asset, but there are professionals working these cases, and as long as they've got the resources, and the resources and the time to investigate these cases, they're going to have access to so much more information, so much more than we're ever going to have or know. And so yeah, Ruthie just represents us again, a heightened version of us, and by us I mean people who are especially interested in true crime. Okay, next question is, do you enjoy the process of writing an unreliable narrator, and why? So yes, unreliable narrator Ruthie, my haphazard heroine, absolutely, I love writing unreliable narrators. And that's because I'm not an expert, I'm not a detective, I'm not a forensic pathologist or a psychologist. I've not done anything other than read other people's work and try to learn from these experts. And so writing an unreliable narrator, in a way what I'm writing is just a real life person thrust into this like really extraordinary situation, and I love exploring that. Like how would I react in that situation, how would my friends react? And they're not experts. You often won't find or rarely will you find an expert. We might have them on the periphery. We might have detectives and investigators on the periphery of my stories, but my lead characters are not going to be. They're not going to be characters that are experts in their field, because I find that too constrained, too restrictive. I want my characters to be learning on the job, kind of like I've been learning as an author for the last couple of years. Definitely learning on the job. Okay, the next question. You honour Dame Ngaio Marsh with some Easter eggs and leave the girls behind. Why? And any hints about those hidden moments? Okay, so I've joked a few times, although there's definitely truth to it, that I'm an accidental crime writer. With my first novel, with Before You Knew My Name, I didn't think it was going to be classed as a crime novel. Not really sure what I thought it or how I thought that story would be embraced, but it was a huge surprise to me, and it ended up being very fortuitous that the crime community in particular, that's readers, that's booksellers, that's awards as well, embraced that story, and then I came to embrace that mantle of crime writer with fervor and passion, and realized it was probably obvious all along to everybody except me that I'd do something like this. But through that journey over these last few years of learning on the job, I came to realize how much I didn't know about this genre that I'm now leaning into, especially now that I have accepted the mantle of crime writer. So I learned about Dame Ngaio Marsh, and how she was right up there with Agatha Christie as in the golden age of detective fiction, and I hadn't known that. I wasn't paying homage to the women that came before me because I simply didn't know about them, which I don't think is unusual, unfortunately. And so, to try and rectify that or honor that, I thought with this novel, with Leave the Girls Behind, that I would Find just little ways to slide in references to Dame Ngaio. Also, the epigraph, that's an obvious one. That's taken from one of her novels, and it's about red herrings, and that's really me sort of setting the reader up. So readers, be warned that epigraph is not just it's not just there because it's from Dame Ngaio Marsh and I like it. It's meant to set you up for a story that is full of red herrings and full of my haphazard heroine Ruthie jumping at shadows. As for the other little Easter eggs about Dame Ngaio, I think I'm going to leave those for readers to find. There's Easter eggs all through that book, including when it relates to my first novel, so references back to Alice Lee. There's little things that I've had a lot of fun, and maybe it's because I'm living in the era of we're all living in the era of Ms. Taylor Swift, but it's actually just really fun to tie your work into context of your own work, but also into the context of the broader work of crime fiction in New Zealand in particular. Okay, next question. Can we ask you about your love of musicals and the influence of them in your work, perhaps with the rhythm and pacing of your novels? Okay, I love this question. So, the do musicals influence not just no, not just my work, but the rhythm and pacing of how I write? And I can see myself doing it now. The way that I use my hands, uh, the way that I talk. I was told this many years ago. It's like you're singing, not necessarily well, but there is a modulations. There's a quality to the way that I communicate that I love putting onto the page as well. So I'm very conscious of rhythms. I'm very conscious of tapping things out, and making sure that on the page it sounds good as well as as well as makes sense. That's something that I'm really conscious of when writing what I consider what I want to be very accessible fiction, so accessible literary fiction, where a real deliberate there's a deliberate choice with the words, and the rhythm of those words. And the other thing is that musicals have they have they have beats and they have moments, things like the I Want number and the 11 o'clock number, which I reference and Leave the Girls Behind, that I think I'm more familiar with than perhaps. This is outing myself a bit here, but I've never taken. I've taken a couple of writing classes, but I've never studied writing professionally. I don't have, any credentials in that realm, and so I think I'm more familiar with how musicals tell a story, and how they use very small amounts of time. It was 3 minutes 25. It's like a pop song, I guess, as well, to tell a full story, rather than sort of the hero's journey narrative arc that we might learn about if we're studying writing. I'm just more comfortable in that space of how the great lyricists told such effective stories in a really short amount of time, and take you on such a journey. So I've tried to emulate that. I have a secret. It's not a secret, so why do I call it a secret? I have a latent desire to write a musical. I am hoping that I'll get to do that one day and sort of then combine. Will it have crime in it? Maybe. But yeah, combine my love of language with my love of musicals, and see what I can come up with.